defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There's some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC. A boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Everybody get your roll on. I know shorty and she doesn't want no slow song. Had a man last year, life goes on.
What is happening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be on this journey with you. You guys just outdo yourselves every week. The tweets, the DMs, the Instagram posts, man. I just wanted to say thank you, man. And the Facebook posts and the messages that you send me, let me know how much you're rocking with me and how much you're enjoying the show. And that just makes my day. We work really hard here at the Mike Muse Show to bring you some really interesting content, really from a curated perspective, and bring you topics that aren't really being discussed, but are right in front of our face. And that really impacts everything that we do from, as you know, I think you can repeat it with me. So say it with me, from the food that we eat, from the cars that we drive, to the wine that we drink, from the sneaks that we rock. It all has some policy implication to it. And I'm really glad that you're really starting to discover that and to really connect the dots for yourself with that. And so as always, keep tweeting me throughout the conversation. I really want you guys to be participating in it. I want it to be a two-way dialogue. Hit me up as always, at I am Mike Muse. That's M-U, S as in Sam E, on Twitter and Instagram. And of course, on the Sirius XM Twitter handle at SXM Insight. And on channel 121 here at Sirius, man, we're having a ball. And listen, again, I feel like I have to outdo myself every time because the expectations you guys have for me now is getting bigger and bigger. And I hope I didn't disappoint you guys with how we have curated this episode coming up today. And I'm entitling this Asian Americans Unplugged. I've been really just fascinated by this whole Asian American experience. Me and my friend, we've been talking a lot this lately about what's happening here in New York City, what's happening at Harvard, what's happening at the University of California school system, and really what's happening at the potential of the Supreme Court. I said, you know what? Let me do a deep dive into this. Let me do a deep dive into this episode on the notion of Asian American representation, education, innovation, and policy, and in particular through the lens of activism. Representation and education. You know, I want to know from you too as well. Let's go on this journey together. Like, what's missing from mainstream conversations around Asian American representation in educational spaces? We're going through a lot right now in the New York public school system with the magnet schools really redefining their admissions process into the magnet schools here of Stuyvesant High School, Brooklyn Tech, and Bronx Science. Also, too, what's really happening in the University of California systems and recruiting process for Asian Americans, the future Supreme Court, and what that could mean for affirmative actions, and really where does Asian Americans fall into affirmative actions, and how do they feel about affirmative action? And then let's just go into Silicon Valley. Let's talk tech, homies. Let's talk tech and innovation. Let's talk about the assumption that Asians are doing fine in Silicon Valley. That's my assumption. I'm sure you guys have your own assumptions too as well. But what about the Asian American women? How are they being represented? How are they being brought into the conversation? And do they really have issues? And then the whole larger point is just Asian Americans in the larger scope as a person of color perspective of activism. Which ways do Asian American voices should be included into the conversation? How is their voices being valued or perhaps being ignored? And I got to be honest with you. You know, with me, I'm always about being vulnerable on this show. I actually don't know really where they fall. Are they marginalized? Are they disadvantaged? Or are they the model minority? Do they have, selective marginalization, or in that tone of conveniently being marginalized in order to be advantageous for them in their efforts? I honestly just don't know. But I do know I have some fantastic guests here with me today who has really pushed me in that conversation and who has really pushed me and shaped my thinking in terms of, and I don't have an opinion formed, and I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going in with this with my eyes just wide open and just being curious and letting my guests really do the talking about it. But I have one really interesting person coming up on by the name of Nina Yang Bon Jovi. Listen, if you don't know the name, you know the movies. Nina and Forrest Whitaker are partners, producing partners in Hollywood, and they're responsible for the discovery of Ryan Coogler. So basically, because of Nina, we got Black Panther. That's basically what I'm trying to say. They produced Fruitvale Station with Ryan Coogler. They went on to produce Dope with Pharrell. They went on to produce Songs My Brothers Taught Me. And they also went and produced Roxanne, which was just recently on Netflix. And most importantly, they have their movie out right now, Sorry to Bother You. Go see it in theaters. I promise you won't be disappointed. So I really want to understand Nina's point of view and her lens of being an Asian American, but really involved in these movies and the creativeness of Hollywood that has such contextualization of African American narratives. And in the studio with me, I have the incredible Sarah Nguyen. Oh boy, and she is dynamite in her own regard. Sarah is an award-winning filmmaker, director, writer, entrepreneur. She's passionate about diversity in media and amplifying stories of Southeast Asian Americans from immigrant stories. Man, she's been everywhere on NBC News, Huffington Post, Complex. I mean, you name it, she's done it. And boy, let's talk about the awards. She has an Emmy Awards and Los Angeles Press Club alongside with Time, CNN, and ESPN. So just a little rock star and a millennial activist who is definitely on the rise. And followed by that, we're going to couple it with a really good friend of mine by the name of KJ Bachi. He's a smart one of the group, folks. He's a senior Sorry, you're smart too.
Hold up.
You had the braids.
Let's redo that take.
So with that being sorry, you messed me up, man. Let me flow my intro. Let me do me, Sarah. So we have KJ Bachi. KJ Bachi is a senior staff attorney and senior advisor for telecommunications, tech, and media at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And what I meant by that, Sarah, is that he does a deep dive. He reads docs. He writes briefs, right? And so we kind of get the fun side of it. We get the chance to be on the mic in front of the camera. And KJ is just stuck in D.C.
Thank you, KJ.
KJ does the hard work for us so we can go out and be great and to advocate for this. KJ has furthered his works with the Asian American and Pacific Islanders coalition groups to ensure fair and accurate depiction of Asian Americans in the media and to promote increased diversity, both in front of and behind the camera. I mean, wow. The things that he has done from legislative counsel for D.C. City Council member and for a member of Congress. His portfolio at AAJC represents immigration, civil rights, and judiciary. And he currently is on the D.C.'s Mayor's Commission of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. Welcome, KJ, and welcome, Sarah. What's happening?
Thank you for having me.
Sarah, did I get everything right?
You nailed it.
Did you sure? Are you happy about that?
I'm stoked.
You are tough.
Killed it. You killed it.
And KJ, did I get everything right?
No, you got it.
You are the smart one, though, right? Do I get a thank you for that intro with that one?
I was definitely laughing on you, but yeah, no, we're all equally smart. How about that? We're all contributing something to the conversation.
So nice, KJ.
Perspective.
So friendly.
Yeah, try to be.
I'm bored by this conversation already. If we're all just going to be mutually
I'm the smart one. No,
agreed. But guys, let's just talk education really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
As I kind of just teased in the beginning of it, this whole notion of admissions and this whole notion of affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
And just to go really further with an admissions perspective, here at the New York City public school system, Asians represent somewhere around 15% of the New York public school system, but yet it's reflective. They're 60% of the population in the specialized magnet schools, which is Stuyvesant and Brooklyn and Bronx, and basically citizens who don't live in New York City. If you get accepted to those, you're pretty much destined for like a top 10 university and to set yourself on this really great trajectory. And so the Mayor de Blasio, is really proposing new standards of admissions in the sense of looking at the holistic approach and really kind of mimicking what's happening in colleges and universities. And guys, the Asian community is really upset about this here in New York. They have been protesting consistently and loudly and saying that if we go to a more holistic approach, not some more sort of metrics based, and listeners out there, what I mean by that is purely just based upon your test scores right now. There's no essays, no recommendations, there's no extracurricular taking consideration. It's just once you graduate from 8th grade, you get invited to participate based upon your test scores. But then I started looking at what's happening in Harvard, right? And then Harvard has a group of individuals who are suing Harvard for discriminations against Asian Americans, and by saying that there's a quota with them, right? And they get rated lower on their personality. And one would say that if it was purely just on metrics, if you take out extracurricular, if you take out personality, if you take out likeliness, that over 50% of Harvard's population would be Asian, right? And then if you look at the University of California school systems, which you're an alum of that system, you went to USC, which is still UCLA, which so that is part of the UC system, in terms of the caps, and quotas that's being talked about right now. And so I just want to get your gut reaction, Zara, in terms of what are your thoughts on this movement that's happening with Asian Americans in education?
Well, thank you for breaking that down, Mike. I just want to take a moment to really distinguish what's happening in the New York State school system. It is not the same as what's happening with the Harvard lawsuit, right? It's because what's happening with Mayor de Blasio's plan to diversify these elite schools, I think it's a great effort to diversify the elite schools, and also a great effort to offer more opportunities to historically marginalized and currently disenfranchised neighborhoods, right? And nothing in Mayor de Blasio's plan involves race, right? So this is not a form of affirmative action, and I want to make sure that when we're talking about this, that we're not conflating it with affirmative action, because it is not about race and it is not a form of affirmative action. And to go back to what you were saying about how there are some Asian groups or members of the Asian community who are really publicly upset about Mayor de Blasio's plan, it's, for me, I feel like this is an issue within this community, which are majority Chinese American led, and it's also a media issue. The organization that is really outspoken against Mayor de Blasio's plan do not represent the majority of Asian Americans in the country, right? And what's happening here is that I believe the organization that is vocal against the plan is like the New York City Asian American Democrats Club, right? But this club is majority Chinese American. If you look at their website, their board is about 90% Chinese American folks, and even within New York City itself, within the Asian American population of New York City, over 50% or nearly 50% are Chinese Americans, right? And then if we look at the U.S. population of Asian Americans, within the U.S. Asian American population, the Chinese subgroup is about 24%, right? So that's just to say that, yes, they are vocal, this conservative Chinese-led group, they are vocal, and even if they claim to represent the Asian American interests, they do not represent a majority of Asian American interests, right? And now moving over to the Harvard lawsuit real quickly, right? The headlines in New York Times, the headlines in the news media, they are false, right? Asian Americans are not suing Harvard for discrimination. It is the Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA. They are the plaintiffs suing Harvard, right? And who is the founder and president of Students for Fair Admissions? It is Edward Bloom. He is a white Jewish man who is a known anti-affirmative action activist, right? He's also led a very similar anti-affirmative action lawsuit against University of Texas Austin in Fisher versus Texas, and the plaintiff there was a white student by the name of Abigail Fisher. Now, he lost the Fisher versus Texas case twice in the Supreme Court. And after he lost that case, he decided he needed to find an Asian plaintiff, right? So he created these recruitment websites online, and one of them was called Harvard Unfair, or unfairharvard.org, right? You can find it online. And these recruitment websites feature Asian American faces, and it says something like, have you been rejected from an Ivy League? Do you feel like you were discriminated against your race? So he's actively recruiting Asian Americans in this case, right? And now we are led to the lawsuit against Harvard, but the media is reporting this very inaccurately. So this is a gross misrepresentation of Asian Americans, because in a national survey that is reported online at aapidata.org, a majority of Asian Americans strongly support affirmative action, right? About 2/3, right? And so in the Harvard case, not only are Asian Americans not suing Harvard, it is Edward Bloom, and I believe he is using Asian Americans as a pawn in his conservative agenda to really, truly benefit privileged white students.
And this individual mentioned he's also trying to expand to University of Wisconsin too as well.
Yes,
and so he is actually on a crusade to bring this to light. But KJ, let's bring you into the conversation, because Sarah outlined it wonderfully in terms of the perspective and bringing context to it, and really showcasing the nuance of it that we often don't get a chance to see because we live in the society of clickbait, right? Where we just click on whatever the headline is, we read the first paragraph, and we move on. But also, too, KJ, goes to the understanding of how nuanced the Asian American community is, and it's just not made up of Chinese, right? These assumptions. And so, KJ, can you talk to us a little bit about the assumptions that we all make in terms of how we describe Asian Americans? But I will be honest, I do still feel there is a sentiment out there in terms of, because we've heard it before, not just with Harvard, right? But in terms of admissions, right? If it was purely just upon your metrics, if you will, your academic aptitude and your test, that Asian Americans would be more the majority, if you will, at universities versus focusing on the holistic approach. So how do you look at this lens through Harvard, KJ, right? And let's use Harvard just now as a metaphor, right? Do you feel that's permeating throughout the Asian American community? And can you talk about the nuance of the Asian American community as we talk conservative, liberal, progressive in the lens of affirmative action?
No, definitely. So, look, I mean, the first thing I would say at the top is that intentional discrimination is always wrong, right? But efforts to increase educational opportunities for everyone is, that's the correct way to go. And Sarah mentioned a study that showed the support from the Asian American community for affirmative action. We, over here at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, we also put out a survey, and that found that 64% of registered Asian American voters, this is back in 2016, they support affirmative action. So I think that's sort of the first thing I want to amplify what Sarah said about the fact that the Asian American community overall does, in fact, support these programs. And that's because our own communities itself are diverse, right? And, a lot of time when we talk about the Asian American community, it's a difficult label to throw in a number of communities that represent different religions, histories with this country, political histories from where they came from. And, just to sort of highlight that, while there are definitely those who have found success in this country. The 2010 census showed that more than 60% of Cambodian, Lao, and Hmong Americans lack a bachelor's degree, as do more than 50% of Vietnamese Americans. So there you see, again, there's a huge difference between what's expected versus what the actuality is, right? And that's why it's incumbent on us to look at holistic admission programs and to support them. And I would say, on top of that, like me personally, the law school I was admitted to, it was through a holistic admissions program, right? They didn't look at just my LSAT scores, but also looked at the sort of activism I had done before, the organization work I'd done, and sort of the policy work, right? The idea was trying to bring in individuals with diverse backgrounds to enter the law, right? To take on these advocacy roles. And so I do think when we are using the term Asian American, we have to be mindful of just what that means in context. And I appreciate Sarah sort of setting that framework up.
Well, guys, if you can take me behind the lens. So, listeners, if you don't know, I'm Black American, and we have this thing called family talk, right? And so things we talk about amongst ourselves in the comforts of our own home that we wouldn't necessarily say in public, right? And so if I can get you and KJ just to kind of take us behind the lens, if you will, in terms of how are you guys discussing this when you guys are out to brunch, right? When you guys are having your family dinners over the holiday time periods, how are you discussing that? But I want to bring some data into the conversation because in 1979, I want to take it to the other coast, to the left coast, to the west coast, to the University of California school systems, which is very layered and nuanced and confusing. And I think I can dedicate a whole episode just to that in particular. But at the time, the University of California president, David Saxon, back in 1979, said they considered race and ethnicity as a way towards college admissions to increase diversity within Asian Americans within the University of California systems. As a result of that, in 1970s and 1980s, the numbers of Asian Americans rose from 198,000 to 497,000 in 1988. So it went from approximately from 2% all the way up to approximately 4%. If you look at the total body of the University of California system. And then from that as well, from like 1976 to 1986, because other schools began to adopt that model for the university president, Harvard saw an increase from 3.6% to 12.8%. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, your hometown, Zara, increased from 5.3% to 20.6%. But then Stanford went from 5.7% to 14.7% Asian Americans. And then Berkeley in California went from 16.9% to 27.8%. So Asian Americans were able to benefit from these affirmative action programs and race conscious admissions in terms of creating it. As a result, that has been pulled back, right, because of this term model minority, right? And the model minorities became the poster child for Asians. Well, look how well they're doing existing now, right? So therefore, that we don't need Asian, affirmative action or race-conscious admissions. And so what I find interesting is that it was convenient and acceptable for the Asian Americans to accept these new admission-based standards back in the 1970s and 1980s. And actually, the Asian American Students Law Association within the University of California system actually sued for the right for the affirmative action to continue. But then now in 2018, now there seems to be an issue with race consciousness. So how do you guys, and you're more than welcome to as well, but how are you guys discussing that, again, in the family talk of the homes, at your parties, at your brunches? And KJ, I want you to be involved in this too.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much for bringing in the historical data and facts of how Asian Americans have supported affirmative action, because yes, Asian Americans, a lot of the Asian American communities have benefited from affirmative action, and I feel like that really hasn't changed too much today. Like as I mentioned earlier, and KJ mentioned, in national studies, nearly 2/3, the majority of the Asian American community support affirmative action. And the communities today that are very, very vocal about anti-affirmative action stances or about, anti-diversity plans, again, I would point to the fact that if we look deeper into these communities, these small minority communities, they are predominantly Chinese American, Chinese led. And that's not to say that all Chinese Americans are conservative, because there are a lot of very, very progressive Chinese American organizations, scholars, and activists. But if I were just to break it down a little bit, so in the U.S. population, within the Asian American population, Chinese subgroup make up 23%. And that's not saying all 23% are conservative. So if we break that number down even more, a smaller number within 23% of the Asian American population are actually the conservative ones who are very vocal about these stances, right? And another thing I really want to point out is, like, when we're talking about Asian American admissions, I really want to stress that there is a need for disaggregation of data, and a disaggregation of data so that we can look at the different Asian American subgroups. And when we do that, and again, the same Asian American, specifically majority Chinese-led conservative groups who are opposed anti-affirmative action, they are also opposed to data disaggregation, right? Because what might we see? We might see that actually maybe a majority of Asian Americans who are getting admitted are from the same subgroups, Chinese American, and as KJ mentioned earlier, the Southeast Asian community are still underrepresented. The Southeast Asian community have higher poverty rates, higher than the national average, and that includes folks from the Lao, Hmong, Cambodian, and Vietnamese communities, which then lead to our recent history of like the Vietnam War, right, who are heavily refugee immigrant backgrounds.
Which is why some of these programs were put in place, is for social economics, right, and to bring equity into higher education systems. So KJ, if you could just speak to what we're talking about and in terms of the family talk, right? How are you and your friends talking about it?
Right. No, I was going to say Mike wants some family talk. He doesn't want data. So look, I think the idea is, I mean, look, I can't speak to the motivations of the plaintiffs and all the folks who are involved, but honestly, it comes from a way more of a sort of individual, I would dare say, selfish perspective, right? Just looking at it purely from the emotional, sentimental perspective, taking away data and what the community stands for and doesn't stand for. I think the folks who are largely concerned, you hear what the narratives they're talking about, and it's largely focused on their concerns about their children, or I believe the plaintiffs who are involved are folks who did apply and didn't get in, right? And I think what we're doing over here at Advancing Justice AAJC through Twitter and through other means is trying to dispel this notion that everyone has, the right, the entitlement to attend one of these schools, right? We're not even talking about the idea of alumni. We're not talking about sort of the legacy folks. We're not talking about athletic recruitment, right? When all of these factors are done, every community of color sort of gets hurt in that aspect, right? In terms of actually being able to attend. And so, honestly, it's for folks who kind of play in the civil rights area. I think for us, it's a no-brainer in terms of supporting holistic admissions programs, because we all know that diversity is a strength. And I think the concern. Oh, go ahead.
Because if you were here in person, I would be slapping your shoulder right now for you to repeat exactly what you said just right now, because that's what I always talk about when the lens of affirmative action from a Black American perspective, in the sense of we always conveniently, and I put that in air quotes, leave out the legacies. we conveniently leave out the seats that have been set aside for the athletes. Wouldn't that be interesting if all the athletes across like the Big Ten and the Big D1 football school programs ought to have a 4.0 and like a 1600 SAT scores in order to participate into that program? I think we would see a different economic outcome at these universities at the bowl games. But KJ, with the holistic approach, and Sarah, you really have guys really rounded this conversation out really well. That all goes into jobs after you graduate and upward mobility. And we all know right now the hot jobs on the market is tech. And we all know right now everybody wants to be in Silicon Valley. And so again, I'm coming in with a lot of assumptions. And KJ and Zara, you guys have really been helping me to shape and think differently about it. And I just think you guys are good in Silicon Valley. I just think that the majority of people who work in Silicon Valley are white men and Asians. At least that's the narrative that's out there with that. And so when we come back from the break, I want to know, is that true? And are you guys having issues out in Silicon Valley? Are y'all being marginalized, quote unquote? And I'm being tongue in cheek, people. And so, KJ, I want you to lead us into this discussion on tech in Silicon Valley and tech policies. All right. Can you do that, KJ?
Definitely, yeah.
Sarah, can you rock that out?
I got you.
All right. Hey, yo, ladies and gentlemen, you're tuned in. Hit us up, man. You can see this is a really interesting conversation. And if you don't know the answers, that's fine, too. Clearly, you can see that I don't know. And this is the whole point of us, is to really dispel all the notions that are out there. Hit me up on Twitter at I am Mike Muse, M-U as in Sam E. And on the Insight channel at SXM Insight. And we will be right back.
I just flip the switch. Flip, flip. I don't know nobody else that's doing this.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am back. And as I teased you out right before the break, we were going to talk about tech. And do Asian Americans really have an issue in Silicon Valley? And I asked KJ to kind of kick us off here. This is something that he really specializes in, is tech policy in the digital space within Silicon Valley. And then Sarah, as you can tell, she has lots to say about this too as well. I used to see her jonesing in her seat right now to get in on this conversation. And folks, I got to admit, I was so excited to talk about KJ and his intro that I just said everything at one time. And I want to be very clear. He does not work on the Hill anymore. And his work is completely separate at the AAJC. So I'll make sure to clarify that really quickly. But folks, when I was doing a deep dive into data within Silicon Valley, Sarah, what I found really interesting is that in terms of the workforce within Silicon Valley, based on some data that got revealed in 2013, Asians and Asian Americans comprise 27% of the workforce at Google, Intel, Yahoo, Hewlett-Packard, and LinkedIn, but just held 13% of the executive jobs. But then to go further, KJ, I discovered that white women were 31% more than likely than Hispanic men to be executives and 88% more than likely to be Asian. So let's just get into it, KJ. Is that the issue that's happening in Silicon Valley when it comes to executive leaderships? Is that what the Asian American community feels some frustration with? Or is it also to access just to get into Silicon Valley?
There is a severe lack of diversity in tech companies, right? We have organizations that have compiled data from major tech companies over the course of the last 5 or more years. For Black and Latinx communities, we see that number is stagnant, right? It goes up by like 0.3, 0.4%, whatever it is. And considering the fact that these companies have been saying for the past few years, like, look, we're going to create a better internship program, we're going to put more money into STEM education, and yet the numbers speak for themselves, right? For the Asian American community, the issue is exactly as you sort of talked about, the pipeline to executive leadership. While they are definitely overrepresented when it comes to the more technical positions, when you actually see their representation in executive leadership, that number shrinks entirely. And again, at the top of the segment, we talked about the Southeast Asian American communities, and to see what their representation is like in Silicon Valley, I'd bet you 3 months worth of salary if that's a lot for you, but like whatever it is, I would bet you that I'd bet you that number is still really lacking. And so it is definitely a different issue for different communities. But then when you look at the sort of conscious bias that moves people up the ladder, looking for qualities that may not fit with the model minority. And so while I do think we should all be striving, all communities of color should be striving to get into those top positions, right? Mm-hmm. And so to sort of splice up and be like, look at these communities, the numbers are low here and not as good here. I think that's definitely something that's the beginning of the conversation. But I think the second aspect is like, who are the folks that are actually running the show? And I can promise you it's not the folks doing the programming in Silicon Valley.
So KJ, I'm going to take it to Sarah. As we look at the data that I just suggested, how as an activist do you rally around this issue when we see that the makeup is 47%, of Asian Americans, and we see it's less than single digits for African Americans. Like, how do you do coalition building, around that when there almost seems they're two steps ahead of other groups when it comes to access, even get into Silicon Valley, but then also through the pipeline to executive leadership.
I definitely want to echo what KJ was saying, that there is a diversity problem in Silicon Valley. There's a lack of diverse talent from a lot of Black and brown communities of color. And as an activist, or as someone who is committed, or anyone who would be committed to social and racial justice, just because my community, the Asian American community, seems to be overpopulated in Silicon Valley doesn't mean that you cannot show up and commit to creating a system and creating structures and creating policies that benefit all communities of color and benefit all underserved, disenfranchised, marginalized communities, because that is really what social justice and racial justice is about. It's not just about saying, like, it's not crying about certain issues around education inequalities and then being silent when we look at Silicon Valley, right? So definitely from an Asian American perspective, I think rallying my community and making sure that we all still show up for racial justice and increasing diversity in Silicon Valley is important, right? Because that is part of the work, part of the bigger picture work. Is not just about the interests of your personal community. And going back to family talk that you were encouraging earlier, I feel like conservative Chinese American-led organizations who are fighting against affirmative action or fighting against de Blasio's plan are working out of personal and selfish interests, right? And the other thing I wanted to add was about what KJ was saying about disaggregation of data. Yes, disaggregating the Asian subgroups within Silicon Valley, and I bet you 4 months salary like that.
That would leave my money out of this, guys.
Another thing I would love to disaggregate is within the Asian American community, what percentage of that population are U.S. citizens and what population are immigrants, right? Because the U.S. has a history of doing a brain drain from a lot of East Asian countries, bringing the talent here. And currently in Silicon Valley today, the STEM workers make up over 50% of foreign-born folks.
I just cannot wait to bring Nita into this conversation. I'm sure Nita can understand exactly the segue that I'm going to bring her in on into the conversation. But Sarah, I love how you just mentioned that. And what I'm gathering from you is this whole notion of stronger together, right? And when all individuals from people of color communities come together and we have this unified strength, if you will, we can really bring more unified change, right? And more seats to the table. So KJ, with that being said, if you can close us out on the tech piece, what is it around tech policies that is of concern to Asian Americans, right? Like, we get this notion of assumption that, again, and you and Sarah have done a great job of dispelling these misnomers for our audience today, that you guys all have broadband, all Asian American households have access to the digital web. And is that true? Is that a great assumption to have? And if so, what are some tech policies that your think tank in DC is really advocating for currently around tech?
Right. No, I appreciate the question. So, the biggest issue with when you're thinking about the Asian American community is data. And I'm pretty sure this show probably has the word data brought up a lot more than perhaps in the past. But you need data. And looking at the example of the digital divide for one instance, when you look at indicators of the digital divide, you look at education level, language proficiency, and income, right? And if you're sort of lower on the scale for those three indicators, then the chances you're on the wrong side of the digital divide. And yet, when studies look at the Asian American community and the digital divide, it shows that, there was a study in 2016 by Nielsen that showed that 93% of Asian Americans are online. But then when you looked at the actual way they conducted that survey, it was through an online survey, right? So obviously, if you're asking folks, like if they've access to tech and you're doing the survey on tech, you're going to have a high number. And you also have issues of English proficiency and so on, which, again, translations, getting folks who can translate is critical. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to kind of narrow down where we can study the digital divide within the Asian American community. And beyond that, collecting a lot of narratives, collecting a lot of stories, right? There are recent refugee communities all across the country that, they're struggling. Their first thought is not to actually buy a cell phone or a laptop. It's literally to pay the bills to survive. And so from one tech policy issue, I'd say equitable access, not only for the Asian American community, but for all underserved communities. That's something that we are definitely working hard on and looking at policies that, that come out of the FCC, and advocating for those that can increase the chances to narrow the gap. That's what we work on.
Yeah. Well, I think now is a perfect time to bring in our guest who has been patiently waiting with us. She goes by the name of Nina Yang Bon Jovi. And ladies and gentlemen, I've introduced her at the top of the show. But just to reset, I think it's really important to reset and to really show why it's important to bring her into conversation right now. Nina is a leader in independent cinema, and she's a champion of diverse voices along with her producing partner, Forrest Whitaker. As I said before, make sure you give Nina a round of applause for her and for discovering Ryan Coogler, which is how we got essentially Black Panther in their first film, Fruitvale Station. I'm sure you guys have heard of that film, Avi. Then they went on to produce some really dope stuff, including the film Dope, Songs My Brother Taught Me. And she's also produced a Roxanne story, which was fantastic, which can be found on Netflix. And the reason why this conversation is so on point right now and so timely is that her current film is out right now, Sorry to Bother You. And it really talks about what we're talking about right now in work, the workforce environment, Silicon Valley, the whole code switching. How do people of color have to adapt and adjust in these spaces? Like, how do Black Americans have to adjust in these spaces? How does Asian Americans have to adjust in these spaces of whiteness, really? And so, Nina, I just want to say welcome to the Mike Muse Show officially.
Hi, Mike. Nice to meet everybody.
Yes, we are so excited to have you, Nina. Audience, full disclosure, this is my second time being in a conversation with Nina. We had a great opportunity to be in conversation at the Academy, at the Oscars, and really talking about diversity in film. And I just couldn't wait to find a way to have a part 2. So, Nina, just congratulations on Sorry to Bother You. Can you tell us a little bit more about the film that is out right now in theaters? Everyone must go see this.
Yes, I was just listening in on what you guys were talking about, and I was just thinking, man, everybody, all Asian people got to go see this movie.
We're going to make sure of that, Nina.
Yeah, because Sorry to Bother You is we call it the absurdist comedy, utilizing sci-fi, magical realism to talk about the world of telemarketing. But, I mean, many people who saw it said, man, that was a Trojan horse. It's a Trojan horse that came at us. We didn't expect that. It's about unionization. It's about, trying to make a difference through organizations and organizing. So there's, and I love the fact that this movie right now is getting such love from so many people, so many different demographics and age demographics. So many of my friends, watch his film, and I'm in a theater full of white people, and I was like, that's amazing. And I go, did they like it? And they're like, yeah, they loved it, but there were, of course, some uncomfortable parts of it. Because I go, well, that's what makes a good movie. It makes people think. So I encourage more Asian Americans to go support it. We purposely cast this amazing man named Stephen Young, who is from The Walking Dead, and just to also, when it comes to casting, it's about finding the best people of color for this movie. And I remember when we were casting the original role that Stephen Young has, was really for an African American, and this film is predominantly all people of color minus Armie Hammer. But when that role came up, I'm like, what about Stephen Young? Let's have a really hot Asian guy in that role. And I remember Boots was like, you think? I go, yeah, it'll be amazing. And he'll be like, he said, who? I go, Stephen Young from Walking Dead. And I reached out to Stephen's agent, and we got on the phone. Boots got on the phone with him, and he was so excited to read something so spectacularly different than anything he's seen. And then he met Boots, and he's like, I'm in. So that's been the way that's been a way when it came to casting this film. People reading the script and know there's a bigger motivation, there's a bigger mission here, is to create empathy for audiences, to create empathy like this. We can't be sitting around complacent. We have to make change when things are bad.
And I think that's so important in terms of when we talk about representation matters, right? And having an Asian American at the helm of a film that is, cast majority of people of color, but to really make sure that all voices and narratives of people of color are really represented into that. And that's how champion diversity really comes to light. It's no different than what Sarah was just mentioning in terms of when we're all at the table together, we can advance more narratives and advance more issues at the same time. And casting Stephen Wynn was just fantastic on your part and really smart about it. In particular, he's just such a dynamic actor and such a huge following and such a popular person to really begin to shape and really transition narratives. But Nina, as an Asian American, as a filmmaker, and the really at the crux of this film is really about the whole notion of code switching that we talk about all the time. And code switching has become so predominantly known within the Black universe. And as we've been having on the show all day today, it's this whole family talk, right? Sometimes that gets left out of the narrative of Asian Americans having the need to code switch, if you will. Can you talk to us a bit about your experiences and even maybe something that Stephen Wynn on the film set even talked about how Asians actually have to code switch too as well?
Well, I think that code switching is really alive and well in the Asian American community. Maybe we don't recognize it, but I think back to me climbing the corporate ladder back in the day when I was trying to get into the film business and working in certain places. I worked at a studio during grad school, and that's when you actually have to, what I call, be white adjacent. You know, so you are not singled out as the minority. Like I'm part of the group, you know, and you behave a certain way so you can climb the corporate ladder, get accolades by being very well behaved. That's what Asian Americans call the model citizen, you know. And as I go through the industry of dealing with the studio and the corporate world of film and entertainment, that's what we have to do. And as I grew in the industry, as I elevated my stature and what I do, I became more and more vocal and then start calling out injustices and things, inequities. And then I was really, at one point, maybe about, it was on and off a few years ago, and I'll be like, I'm really mad at the Asian American men in my industry, in corporate jobs, whether they're in studio executive level jobs or agency level. And I'm like, they never fight for us. They never fight for people of color. And then I have this dear friend of mine who's been in the agency world for 15 years. He's Asian American. And one day I said, what's up with that? And he said, you know what, we have to climb the corporate ladder just like you did in the film world and the creative side to the top before we can be vocal about things, because we'll be called out and then we would never be able to climb. Right. So he goes, so stop being angry about it. It's just that we had to get to a certain level, then we could start empowering, you know, other Asian Americans. And I was just like, oh, so that's code switching to me, you know?
Absolutely. And the reason why you were just such a perfect guest to have on this is because all day we just been peeling back, you know, these assumptions that Americans have about Asian culture and about Black culture, and really where does Asian Americans sit within the civil rights space, right? Are Asian Americans marginalized? You know, are they not? You know, are they conveniently marginalized when it's time to be selective in terms of for their benefit for the outcome? And so all day we've really just been peeling that layers back and really putting to bed some untruths with that. And the reason why you were so perfect, Nina, is because you are Asian American, but your producing partner is Black American. And as it shows the power of togetherness and how you can create such magic with the Ryan Coogler, but just as well as you guys can then cast Stephen Wynn in this type of film. Talk to us a little bit from your personal point of view, Nina, being Asian American, being in this dynamic POC space, you know, within Hollywood, and what your lens has been in dealing with the African American community.
Yeah, I agree with this. You know, at first 10 years of my career, I call it failing left and right, but I would never exchange those experiences because it taught me to become a better producer. And by the time I met Forrest Whitaker in 2009, that was, 9 years ago, we were on a journey to create a story that talked about Asian Americans as well as African Americans. That project, if it didn't go, but what it did was it created a friendship that we said, let's start this company. And Forrest actually asked me, he said, why don't you join me and let's create a new company and let's, do something incredible. We weren't sure what exactly that was, but we just got along, and we had very similar mindset on trying to make a difference and shift the paradigm when it comes to people of color and storytelling. So when he asked me to join him, first year we're doing television. We had a television deal at ABC Disney, but during that first year, a professor at USC introduced me to Ryan Coogler. He was still in school. So when I met Ryan, I was just like, man, this kid is incredible. There's something so special about him. And then he left me his short films, and I remember watching them, and I'm in tears going, he is a storyteller. Mm-hmm. So Forrest watched the same short films, told him to come back in, and said, what do you want to do? And he told us about Fruitvale. And we go on this new journey of, let's produce his first feature film about Fruitvale Station. And what's incredible is, tying back to what you were saying, Mike, is how the Asian community and the Black community coming together. I could tell you that we went everywhere in the U.S. trying to get this film funded, and no one wanted to do it. So incredibly, my friends in Asia are the ones who funded Fruitvale Station.
Wow.
So and they've been with me since Fruitvale. They funded Dope. They funded Roxanne, Chloe Zhao's Songs My Brothers Taught Me, and they're the majority investor, Sorry to Bother You. So whenever you look at any of our films, there's a little section called Very Special Thanks. You'll see a bunch of Chinese names.
That is awesome. And that's like the spirit of true collaboration, Nina, which is why I'm just so excited and honored just to have you on this show right now, because you represent the hope and the outcomes of what working together could do when people of color come together. And Sarah, if I can bring you into the conversation really quickly, in your experience as a documentary filmmaker, you know, do you see these type of narratives that are out there just aren't being told, that the Asian American community and the Black American community are actually more joined than the media appears to have us being separated?
Yes, definitely. I feel like the Asian American community has a very long history of working with the Black community, as well as the Latinx community, as well as the queer and trans community for many, many decades now, ever since civil rights movement, Third World Liberation Front, right, during the rise of the Black Panther Party. And Nina, your story was so inspiring, and like mentioning how a lot of, you know, Chinese funders funded all these projects. I think the stories about Black and Asian and brown, like solidarity, the truth and reality of the solidarity is very present and real, but these narratives don't ever get shine, right? They don't get love in the media press. I feel like mainstream news media, they love to share and uplift conservative narratives from the Asian community, and it's a very small minority of the Asian American community.
And KJ, as Nina has spelled out so brilliantly in terms of collaboration between Asians and Blacks, and Sarah brought in Latinos and LGBTQ, how is it in D.C., you know, with the AAJC? How do you guys work with other, like, legacy civil rights organizations? Do you see partnerships within DC happening in the likes of a Nina and a Forrest Whitaker collaboration?
No, we definitely do. A lot of the work we do here in the civil rights space is definitely on a coalition basis, because, I mean, frankly, that's how you sort of uplift the voices of all those who are trying to get their message across, right? And one of the organizations that's sort of undergoing a civil rights audit right now, which is Facebook, that's a number of us from the legacy organizations to those who are sort of, I would say, newer to the space in the last 2 decades or so, like the Asian American community. We're all sort of part of this space and talking to the sort of the consultant they brought on to point out this kind of issues that we're facing. And on the back end, we'll have conversations, you know, among the organizations to say, like, look, are we making sure that these issues are being uplifted, right? What do we want to see change? What type of language are we trying to, like, you know, monitor closely on Facebook? Or what type of space is being created for, say, the white supremacist sort of faction of our communities versus, you know, our own communities, right? So I do think collaboration is critical. And one other thing I would just sort of echo Nina's earlier point about sort of the difficulty of females sort of moving up the corporate ladder. I think you definitely see that in tech, you know, going back, kind of harkening back to that conversation, just to point that out as well, that regardless of race, gender is still a huge sort of ceiling for moving up the ladder. And you see that across industries. And I think that it is a frustration when folks, you know, tell these kind of stories about reaching out to folks within their own community, but those folks are still trying to make their way through, right?
Mm-hmm. Nina, I just want to just in close, just end with you for a moment here, and just say, one, thank you for all the work that you've done to advance these narratives, because this isn't easy in the type of films that you're creating. What has been able to keep you going, to push through, to fight for the funding for Fruitvale Station, to fight to get a movie like Dope made, and Songs My Brothers Taught Me, and Sorry to Bother You? Like, what is it in your constitution that says, I have to do this no matter what, no matter the frustrations, no matter if Hollywood isn't ready for this, I'm going to make them ready?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing that up, because every independent film that Forrest and I produce, I always say, that's my last one. I'm done. It's so hard. I'm like, it's just like, oh, every film, I'm like, no, that film almost killed me. And Sorry to Bother You was one where it's so recent. It's such recent memory. I'm like, oh my God, this film is so difficult to produce. It is so ambitious. It's so challenging. I mean, from the funding stage, I didn't give many of my investors a script, especially my Asian investors. I'm like, don't bother, because you just got to trust me. Look at the track record we've had. Look at the revenues we created for these films that are important, not only critically acclaimed, but they make money. So it's that more of that pitch. But going into the film, it is so challenging because of the fact that people doubted it. They said, Boots Riley is a rapper, a musician, and it's like, no, he's a genius. He's a revolutionary filmmaker. But I was nervous. But until I saw that first frame on set, I was like, holy crap, this guy's, he knows exactly what he's going to do, and he's able to deliver it. And going through that entire process is so rewarding. And then see him launch, be able to have a hand in launching his career at, his age right now in his 40s, where usually people always say to us, what's the next 23-year-old? What's the next 25-year-old? Because they're referring to Ron Coogler. I'm like, you know what? I got this amazing 45-year-old who's been an activist, a musician his whole life. Now he's going to put all that knowledge into filmmaking, and it's really, social change through filmmaking, social justice through filmmaking. So that keeps me going. I do get discouraged because Hollywood business is very merciless. People are not kind. There's only a handful of people that you really love, and you hold on to them as you move forward. But it's a merciless business, but what keeps me going is that every time when I say, I don't want to do, I'm thinking about taking a break, or maybe I should think about teaching or something. Some other topic comes along, some filmmaker comes along and says, I have this amazing idea, or I have this script, and I see somebody's short film and I'm completely inspired, but they're a person of color. It's tough. And I go, you know what? I got to do this. And Forrest is with me all the way. He said, this is what we do. And when I felt down, he'll say, hey, how does it feel to change lives? Wow. And then I have to pause and go, wow, okay.
Wow.
That's what keeps me going. So,
well, Nina, thank you for keeping going, and thank you for, I know that you will always keep going to get these narratives out there, and this is exactly what we do on the Mike Muse Show, is just intersect policy and pop culture to get people to see themselves through lifestyle, and this is our version of advocacy. So it's an honor that we've been able to cross paths. Nina, how can people reach you on Twitter if they want more information, and how can people go see Sorry to Bother You that's out right now?
Well, they can reach me on Twitter. It's NY Bon Jovi, and same with Instagram. And please go see Sorry to Bother You. We are in 805 theaters this past weekend.
Wow.
We have to keep pushing it forward, so our studio will give us even more screens. I feel like it's important, and hopefully more Asian Americans get to see it too, because it's about empowerment and it's about creating solidarity amongst all people of color.
Sarah, where can people reach you on Twitter and Instagram?
It's 1 ounce gold, spelt out ONEOUNCEGOLD for both.
And then, KJ, how can people find you on Twitter and the work that your institute is doing?
At KJ Bogchi, and all the work for our organizations, I sort of amplify through that as well.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Mike Muse Show. Nina, Sarah, KJ, thank you so much for the family talk and being vulnerable with me today. You guys are welcome back at the Mike Muse Show anytime. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap. Till next week. Peace.
shit popping like Percocet. Got pent up anger, ain't surface yet. Two-stepping like the boss, this person check. Imagine it's him as hand grenade.